Our scripture this morning is from the book of Luke, chapter 2, verses 15 through 20. When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let us go now to Bethlehem and see this thing that has taken place, which the Lord has made known to us." So they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the child lying in the manger. When they saw this, they made known what had been told to them about this child, and all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds told them. But Mary treasured all these words and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen, as it had been told to them. This is the word of the Lord.
I don't know if you all know this, but Santa's usually pretty busy this time of year, so that's a pretty good get when you get him to come to church on Sunday. So I'm sure he gets lots of offers, so that was... All right. That was great. All right. So today we are talking about the shepherds, if you hadn't quite puzzled all that together with all the shepherd stuff. And they were an interesting character in the story that we read every Christmas time. And, you know, they're a familiar fixture for us. And if you know anything about the shepherds of the time, you probably know that they weren't, you know, really all that respected in their time and place. Right? Because the shepherds actually usually were not actually caring for their own sheep. And because Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, was a pretty small community, the chances are that what was actually going on is all the different families would have like one or two, maybe sheep of their own, and they would kind of put them all together and then hire somebody to watch the sheep. And because it's pretty much a 24/7 job. In my last church, we had a vet as part of our congregation, and she used to laugh every Christmas time because all she loved to talk about is how absolutely stupid sheep are. Apparently, they are just like the dumbest animals, and they will get themselves into all sorts of trouble and find themselves in all sorts of precarious positions and places if you let them. And so the shepherds had like an active job. And when you think about like the traditional like shepherd's crook, you know, the big stick with the big loopy thing on top, you know, that's to like drag those little suckers out of where they're not supposed to be. Like that's what, it's not just decoration, that has a practical purpose, right? And so they're there to basically kind of wrangle the sheep and make sure that they don't, you know, wander off too far. But the shepherds and the people weren't always the only thing interested in the sheep. There were other animals around that weren't quite so stupid, who used to try to, you know, get the sheep, you know, for their dinner. So the other job of the shepherd, usually at night, was also to defend the sheep. So that's the other thing that stick is for. It's also to ward off other animals that may be trying to take too close an interest in the flock that they are supposed to be guarding. What does that mean? Well, part of what it means is that the shepherd's job was one that most people didn't want because it was hard and it was difficult, and it involved putting yourself in danger on a regular basis, and it was pretty thankless. And at the time, people didn't think much of shepherds to the point that even Aristotle, yes, that Aristotle, a couple of centuries before the time of Jesus, is recorded as saying that among the people, the laziest are the shepherds, who lead an idle life and get their subsistence without much trouble from tame animals. Their flocks wander from place to place in search of pasture. They are compelled to follow them, cultivating a sort of living farm. So Aristotle did not think much of the work that shepherds were doing, and I can guarantee you Aristotle spent exactly 0 days shepherding in his life, right? So if you want to know how far back the disparaging of agricultural workers goes, it goes pretty far back. We can still live in a world today where we probably don't have that many shepherds running around. I mean, there are sheep and animals, and there are people who still do that work. But today there are actually far more people who spend their time and days, doing work for and on behalf of others that most of us would prefer not to think about. Because one of the things that the shepherds are also doing is they are putting themselves at risk, and they are putting themselves at danger, and they are doing that when people don't think much about them. And they're doing that not even, yes, they're doing it for work, but that they're really doing is they are protecting the wealth and the livelihood of others. In the time that Jesus lived, really the only thing that people would routinely have as a demonstration, as a place of demonstration of wealth and what they would have and how much wealth they had was in their animals. So they are actually doing this hard, difficult, dangerous work on behalf of others to preserve and protect the wealth and the livelihood and the well-being of others. It's really no wonder then, and we shouldn't be surprised then, that that's who the angels showed up to and talked to first. Because outside of Mary and Joseph and their family, the shepherds are the first ones to understand and learn about what happened that day when Jesus was born. And so the angels choose not to go to the rich and the powerful and the important and all those folks. They go to the people who are routinely and regularly looked down upon, but who are doing the important self-sacrificial work of preserving the health and the livelihood of their community. God goes to them first through the angels to help us understand right from the beginning the message and that Jesus would be bringing for all of us. None of us, no matter how unimportant we feel or how low we may feel in life or how we may feel overlooked by people and others and we may feel disrespected, that happens for sure. Know that the very day Jesus was born, God came with a special message for those people to say, I see you, I know you're there, I know the work you're doing, it's important, you are loved by me, so much that I want you to be the first to see my first and only born son. Now, like I said, there are still a lot of people who do, this kind of dirty and dangerous work for us today, much of which we, would prefer we don't actually have to think much about, right? And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about the show Dirty Jobs. Anybody watch the show Dirty Jobs? I love that show. That was such a great show. And if you don't know it, it was on kind of like in the early 2000s, and this guy named Mike Rowe would go around, even though he had zero experience in any of the things that he was demonstrating or doing. He had zero experience in any of it, but he would go and he would work alongside people who would do basically dirty jobs, things that we would prefer not to think about or probably do ourselves, including things like sewer line workers and sanitation people and a lot of stuff with animals. He did a lot of stuff with animals. And I used to love watching the show, and it was always funny to watch him do it. Now, if you don't know, Mike himself is an interesting guy. He grew up in the Presbyterian church, which if you're not going to be Methodist, you could do worse than Presbyterian, I suppose. It's fine. No shade. But in fact, his parents still attend the church he grew up in. He grew up in that church. He grew up in the church. He grew up as a Boy Scout. He actually, as part of his Boy Scout work, used to read out loud to students at the Maryland School for the Blind, which is where he got interested in things like narration and things like that. He was actually an accomplished professional singer. And so to see somebody with that background, basically down in the muck and the gook and the slime was always kind of fun too. And he honestly seemed to kind of enjoy it if you ever watched the show. But one of the things that show helps you understand is how much labor, how much work, how much is happening that oftentimes goes unseen that makes our lives and our livelihoods possible. There are a lot of people out there engaged in what is really not only dirty but sometimes dangerous work, not for their benefit, but really for ours. Right? One of the things, Mike Rowe actually first became known for narrating another show called The Deadliest Catch, where we learned that as it happens, statistically speaking, commercial fishing is the most dangerous job you can be engaged in. By far. Basically, if you're a commercial fisherman, you're not getting life insurance. They're not going to do it, right? Because it is that that problematic. And through the show, you learn other things, like, he spent some time with loggers. Loggers, as it happens, are 8 times more likely to die on the job than law enforcement officers are. Of course, law enforcement officers, the prime example of people who put themselves at risk for our behalf. They've actually only now started to do some studies that find out that flight attendants are actually exposed to more radiation than people who work in nuclear power plants. Because when you fly around at 40,000 feet, there isn't as much atmosphere over you, so more of the radiation gets on you. And they have no idea what effect that is having because no one's bothered to study it. We also learn, and of course, today we have, shortages and all these sorts of things. All I've seen on the news lately is as how much there's a shortage in the truck driving industry, and part of the reason is we are incredibly reliant on those people to get us our Amazon packages on time, especially this time of year. And yet, it's work that we'd rather not think about, and we're annoyed by them when they're on the freeways in our way, driving slower than we'd like them to. And it's dirty work, and it's oftentimes dangerous work. Many of you, because I know you, have spent your lives and your professional lives doing things on behalf of others, doing things that are often unseen, and doing things that sometimes come with danger, and doing things that is not primarily for your own benefit, but for others. And I feel that oftentimes we don't honestly remember and honor that as much as we should when we encounter people out in the world. I was reminded also when I was thinking about this back to when I was in seminary. And at the time I was at seminary, my wife Dane was in nursing school. And we used to have this running joke because she would come and whenever she hung out with my friends, she would talk about how boring it was. And whenever we'd have lunch with her friends, I would tell her, I can't eat because you people are disgusting. Because they have no qualms about talking about whatever it is that's happening, because nursing is a very kind of learn by doing profession, so she had to do all these clinical rotations, and they're always swapping stories about it, and they always involve things that I would rather not think about, right? Because I don't do inside parts, right? I don't do it. I don't do blood. I don't do guts. I don't do that stuff. I'm fine. I deal with I'm very interested in your soul, but not in your spleen, if that makes sense. So he's like, that's why I chose my job, and she chose hers because she didn't mind the inside parts. But one of the things that they would that surprised me when we were talking to her, when she was talking to her friends and going through that process, is oftentimes the nurses are really the ones on the front, almost always the ones on the front lines with the patients, and really oftentimes for their patients are the last line of defense. Right? If something happens, and if say like a medication is prescribed wrong, the nurse is the last line in that chain who is responsible to notice that something may be amiss and is responsible to make sure that everything is done the way that it is supposed to be done. When she first started working, she worked here at what is now Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus. And she worked overnights, and she would oftentimes work Saturday nights. So she would work overnight Saturday night, Sunday morning, come home, lay on the couch, and then we'd shove Gavin on the other side of her on the couch so he could watch Thomas the Tank Engine, because he actually used to be small once. Look at him now, he's not so small. And she would lay there and sleep while I, went to church and did my job. And then I would come back, and then she could get a good night's sleep, or get a good day's sleep. Not really a night's sleep at that point. And I remember there was a day when I got back, and I asked her, how was your day last night? We didn't have a chance to talk. And she started talking about how that it was a fine night, except something was, there was a kid that she was taking care of, and she had been prescribed something, and she really just didn't think that it was right. It was different than what he'd been giving. He wasn't sure what was going on, but it was 3 o'clock in the morning. And so they had to basically call the physician at 3 o'clock in the morning to double check that what he had put into the computer system, which was fairly new at the time, was actually the right thing. Now, I didn't think much about this, but it's a really interesting ask to ask a first-year nurse to call up a physician at 3 o'clock in the morning and double check something, because guess what? They're kind of grumpy. I'm grumpy when I'm woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and so are they. And so she talked about, she mentioned how frustrating that was and that he wasn't very kind or nice about it. But at the end of the day, she was right. The medication wasn't what it was supposed to be. And so she's like, so I'm just grateful I made the call because we got the kid when he needed. And I said, oh, what would have happened if you had given him what the system told you to give him? And she's like, nothing good. And I'm like, how bad? Very bad. Oh, so you saved that kid's life last night. And she's like, I don't think so. I'm like, I think you kind of did. I think you kind of did. I think you had to take a risk. I think you had to put yourself out there because she could have been wrong. She could have woken up that doctor for no reason. She could have, which no doubt would have, could have caused problems for her in other ways. And the truth is, these are sort of things that happen all the time. But we kind of hope that the wrong prescriptions don't get written all the time. That's not what I'm saying. But there are those people who stand out there really oftentimes as that last line of defense between us and something unfortunate happening. The shepherds are there as the last line of defense for the sheep. And Jesus says himself that Jesus has come to be the shepherd for all of us. So while it's easy to overlook and forget about and try hard not to think about those who labor on behalf of us, who put themselves at risk on behalf of us, some of you in this room are those people. The truth is, at some point in our lives, almost all of us will be called in one way or another to be those people, to put the needs of others and the safety of others before our own. And God came and presented his own son to the shepherds to remind us how sacred, how important, and how holy that work is. So this season, as we go about all the busyness and everything we need to do, let's also take a moment to think about all of those that do work unseen, who do work that we ourselves would rather not do, so that we can have the health and the safety and the comfort that we have today. It is a blessing and a gift to live where we live and live when we live. It is a blessing and a gift to live in this country and all of the freedoms that come with it. It is not something that was just handed to us. It is something that we continue to have to earn over and over and over again in big and little ways. One of the ways, the most important ways we do it, is when we serve one another, when we put the needs of others before our own, and trust that even though we may never know their names, there are many people out there putting their needs behind ours. There are many people out there that are doing things we don't see on our behalf, and we should be grateful for them, grateful for each other, and grateful that we have those opportunities and people in our lives. Because even though we don't see them, and even though we ourselves sometimes may feel unseen, God came to the shepherds to say, I see you, I know you're there, what you're doing is important, and you are loved. Amen.